"You're too fat to be my wife," he yelled, until her father's billion-dollar secret was revealed. Houston, Texas. If you've lived in Houston long enough, you learn something about the heat. It isn't the polite kind people describe in travel brochures. It presses against your skin the moment you step outside. It hangs in the air, like a damp towel someone forgot to wring out. Even the mornings feel heavy, like the day has already been working for hours before you wake up. That morning felt like that inside Emily's chest. Heavy, slow, hard to breathe through. She stood in the kitchen of a house most people would admire if they drove past it. White stone walls, tall windows, a swimming pool shining in the backyard. From the street, it looked like the home of a happy couple. But houses are good at pretending. Emily leaned against the marble counter and stirred a small pot of oatmeal on the stove. Steam drifted upward in slow curls. She wore an oversized Houston Rockets hoodie that used to belong to Daniel. The sleeves covered half her hands. She liked wearing it, not because it was stylish, because it reminded her of a time when mornings in this house felt different. Before the comments, before the jokes that sounded harmless to outsiders, before the quiet embarrassment that had slowly crept into their marriage like a guest who never planned to leave. Behind her, footsteps crossed the hardwood floor. Daniel, tall, clean-cut, sharp jaw, early 40s. The kind of white man who could walk into a boardroom and immediately be trusted before he even opened his mouth. Daniel stopped near the kitchen island and adjusted the cufflinks on his shirt. His eyes drifted toward the stove, then toward Emily, then back to the oatmeal. He sighed, not loudly, just enough to carry meaning. "You're making that again." Emily kept stirring. "Doctor said it's good for cholesterol." Daniel walked to the cabinet and grabbed a glass. "Doctor also said exercise helps." The sentence settled into the room. Emily didn't respond. She had learned something during the past 10 years. Sometimes silence is the only shield you have left. Daniel poured orange juice into the glass and leaned against the counter. "You know what my coworkers' wives are doing this morning?" Emily continued stirring. The spoon moved slowly through the pot. "Pilates," Daniel said. He took a sip. "Yoga." Another sip. "Running." His eyes drifted down to Emily's stomach. Then he smirked. "But you're in here cooking oatmeal." Emily felt a familiar sting gather behind her eyes, but she swallowed it, because growing up as a black woman in Houston had taught her something important long ago. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes strength looks like holding yourself together while someone else tries to tear you down. Daniel laughed under his breath. "Honestly, Emily." He shook his head. "I don't even know how you let yourself get this big." The words landed casually, like he had commented on the weather. Emily kept stirring, but something inside her shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small crack somewhere deep in her chest. Because the strange thing about pain isn't how it begins. It's how long it can sit quietly before it finally asks you a question. And the question forming in Emily's mind that morning was one she had been avoiding for years. When did love start sounding like criticism? She looked down at the oatmeal, steam rising, soft bubbles breaking at the surface. Her mind wandered somewhere else. A hotel hallway, Dallas. 10 years earlier, Daniel standing in front of her after her research presentation at a medical conference. He had looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the building. "You explain science like poetry," he had said. Emily had laughed. "And you flirt during medical lectures?" Daniel grinned. "Only when the speaker is brilliant." Later that night, they had talked for hours about medicine, about ideas, about the way the world misunderstood obesity and metabolic health. Daniel listened then, really listened. And at sunrise, he kissed her in the hallway outside her hotel room. Before walking away, he whispered something that had stayed with her all these years. "You're different from every woman I've ever met." Back then, it sounded like admiration. Now, Emily wasn't so sure. Daniel set his glass in the sink. "You know something funny?" Emily didn't look up. "My colleagues always ask why I never bring you to company fitness events." The spoon paused for a moment in her hand, then continued moving. Daniel shrugged. "I never really know what to tell them." Emily inhaled slowly. Across the kitchen window, the Texas sun had started climbing higher, bright, sharp, unforgiving. Daniel grabbed his car keys from the counter. "You should really think about getting serious about your health." Emily turned off the stove. The oatmeal was ready, but she didn't serve it yet. Instead, she stood there quietly, because sometimes the moment you finally see something clearly feels strangely calm, not dramatic, just undeniable. And in that quiet kitchen, Emily realized something painful. The man she married wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at a problem he wanted fixed. But the day wasn't finished yet, not even close, because 2 hours later, that same kitchen would be filled with Daniel's family, a table full of laughter, wine glasses, small jokes, and one sentence that would change everything Emily believed about her life. But none of them knew that yet. Not Daniel, not his family, not even Emily. All she knew was that something inside her had cracked that morning. And sometimes, the smallest crack is where a whole new life begins. Welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. If you're new here, we're glad you found us. Subscribe and join this community for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And while you're watching, take a second to comment the time and where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see people from different parts of the world connecting through these stories. By late morning, the house no longer felt quiet. Voices drifted through the hallways. Doors opened and closed. Laughter echoed from the living room as Daniel's family settled in like they owned the place. Emily stood in the kitchen again, but this time the stove was covered with pots and pans. Roasted chicken rested on a platter near the sink. A pot of greens simmered slowly. Mac and cheese baked in the oven, the smell rich and comforting. Cornbread cooled beside the window, the kind of meal Emily grew up watching her mother make every Sunday afternoon. Back on the south side of Houston, food meant more than hunger. Food meant home. It meant family sitting close together, telling stories, arguing about football, laughing until someone spilled sweet tea on the table. Food was love, and Emily still believed in offering love, even when it wasn't always returned. Footsteps approached the kitchen. Daniel's sister appeared in the doorway. She paused when she saw the table. Her eyebrows lifted. "Well," she said slowly, "that's a lot of food." Emily wiped her hands on a kitchen towel. "It's Southern cooking." Daniel's sister stepped closer, scanning the dishes like a food critic studying a restaurant menu. Mac and cheese, cornbread, greens, rice, chicken. Her lips curved slightly. "That's also a lot of carbs." Emily forced a polite smile. "Well, people usually come hungry." Daniel's sister glanced at Emily's body, then back at the food. Then she chuckled. Clearly. The sound drifted into the living room. A few quiet laughs followed. Emily turned back toward the stove. She had learned something over the years. People sometimes hide their cruelty inside jokes, and the safest response is pretending you didn't notice. Soon everyone gathered around the dining table. Daniel sat at the head like he always did. His father poured himself iced tea. His sister filled her wine glass. Her husband leaned back in his chair, already scrolling through his phone. The table looked beautiful. Golden chicken, bright greens, steam rising from the mac and cheese. Emily sat quietly near the end of the table. Daniel's father reached for the serving spoon. "Well," he said, "this looks filling." He placed chicken on his plate, then looked toward Emily. "You cooking like this every day?" Emily nodded politely. "Most days." Daniel's cousin laughed softly. "That explains a lot." Another small wave of chuckles passed around the table. Emily kept her eyes on her plate, fork moving slowly. She had become good at this over the years. Chew slowly, stay quiet, avoid becoming the center of attention. Daniel's sister took a bite of the mac and cheese. She raised her eyebrows again. "Oh, wow." Emily looked up. "Is it okay?" "It's delicious," Daniel's sister said. Then she leaned back in her chair. "But honestly, if I ate like this every day, I'd double in size." A few people laughed again. Emily's stomach tightened, but she kept eating. Daniel said nothing. Not one word. That silence hurt more than the jokes. Daniel's father pointed his fork toward Emily's plate. "You sure you want seconds?" Emily froze slightly. "I didn't take seconds." Daniel's cousin leaned forward. "Yet." More laughter. Emily felt heat creeping into her face. Daniel's sister took another sip of wine. "You know," she said casually, "Daniel used to date fitness models." The table grew quieter, not silent, but the kind of quiet where everyone senses something uncomfortable arriving. Daniel chuckled lightly. His sister continued, "Seriously, remember Lauren?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "That was years ago." "Oh, come on," she said. "She ran marathons." Her husband nodded. "I remember her." Daniel shrugged. "People change." His sister smiled. "Yes, they do." Her eyes drifted toward Emily again. The message didn't need explanation. Emily's fork rested on the plate. The room felt warmer, too warm, and suddenly, something strange happened inside her. The humiliation that had been building for years started pressing upward like steam trapped under a lid. She tried to breathe slowly, tried to stay calm, but the pressure kept rising. Daniel's father leaned forward again. "Emily, you ever think about joining a gym?" Daniel's cousin laughed. "Maybe start small." Daniel's sister added softly, "Or start with smaller portions." That did it. Emily looked up slowly, her chest tight, her ears ringing. Daniel sat there, smiling slightly, watching the conversation like a spectator, not defending her, not interrupting, just letting it happen. And suddenly, Emily realized something painful. The jokes weren't the worst part. The worst part was that Daniel agreed with them. Daniel set his fork down. The metal touched the plate with a sharp sound. Then he leaned back in his chair, looked directly at Emily, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You're too fat to be my wife." The room went still. Every sound disappeared. No forks moving, no chairs shifting, just silence. Emily stared at him. Her heart pounded in her ears. 10 years of memories flashed through her mind. Dallas, the conference, late-night conversations about science, the promises, the belief that she had married someone who respected her. And now he was sitting across the table from her, looking completely comfortable after saying something so cruel. Emily slowly placed her napkin beside her plate. Then she stood up, not shaking, not yelling, just calm. Her chair moved quietly against the floor. Every pair of eyes in the room followed her. She looked directly at Daniel and spoke 3 simple words, soft, clear, then "divorce me." The silence became even heavier. Daniel blinked once, then he laughed, loud, mocking. "You," he leaned forward, "you wouldn't survive without me." Emily didn't respond. She simply stood there, watching him, and something about her silence made Daniel laugh harder. But none of them noticed something else happening. Outside the house, footsteps approaching the front porch. Because just as Daniel leaned back in his chair again, 3 knocks echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. The entire table turned toward the front door. And without knowing it, everyone in that room had just reached the moment where everything was about to change. For a few seconds after the knocking sound echoed through the house, nobody moved. The dining room still held the weight of Daniel's words. "You're too fat to be my wife." They seemed to linger in the air, as if the walls themselves had heard them. Emily remained standing beside her chair. Daniel leaned back in his seat, arms folded across his chest, that same smug expression still resting on his face, like he had simply told an uncomfortable joke. Daniel's sister stared at Emily with raised eyebrows. His father cleared his throat, but said nothing. The knock came again. 3 slow taps against the front door. Daniel sighed, annoyed. "Emily, can you get that?" The way he said it sounded automatic. Casual authority, the same tone he had used for years when asking her to grab something, bring something, fix something. But something was different now. Emily didn't respond immediately. For 10 years she had moved through this house almost by instinct, reacting to Daniel's voice without thinking. But right now, there was a quiet stillness inside her, the kind of stillness that appears when a person reaches the edge of their patience. Emily stepped away from the table. Her footsteps were steady as she walked down the hallway toward the front door. Behind her, Daniel muttered under his breath, "She's being dramatic." A few quiet chuckles followed, but they faded quickly once Emily opened the door, because the man standing on the porch didn't look like someone dropping by for a friendly visit. Gray suit, leather briefcase, calm, measured eyes, the kind of presence that carried serious news. "Emily?" the man asked gently. Her voice came out soft. "Yes, I'm sorry to arrive without notice." He paused for a moment. "My name is Mr. Carter. I'm your father's attorney." Emily felt a strange tightening in her chest. "My father's attorney?" Her father wasn't the type of person who involved lawyers in everyday matters. He was brilliant. Yes, private, definitely. But not someone who handled life through legal paperwork. What's going on? Emily asked. Mr. Carter's expression softened slightly. I'm afraid I have some very difficult news. Inside the dining room, Daniel's sister leaned toward the hallway. Who is it? Emily barely heard her, because Mr. Carter spoke the sentence that makes the world stop for a moment. Your father passed away this morning. The words didn't arrive all at once. They settled slowly, cold, heavy. Emily blinked. No. That can't be right. Her father had called her 2 nights ago. They had argued about something small. He had teased her for apologizing too much. That was always his lecture. You take up space, he used to say. Good. The world needs people who do. Emily shook her head. He was fine. Mr. Carter nodded gently. It was sudden. Behind her, Daniel's voice carried from the dining room. What's taking so long? Emily stepped aside from the doorway. Please, come in. Mr. Carter entered the house. The moment he stepped into the dining room, every conversation stopped. Because strangers with briefcases rarely appear during family lunches unless something serious is happening. Daniel stood slowly. Can we help you? Mr. Carter placed his briefcase on the dining table. He looked first at Emily, then addressed the room. I apologize for the interruption. I'm here regarding the estate of Emily's father. Daniel frowned. Estate? Mr. Carter nodded. Yes. Daniel crossed his arms. Well, you can say whatever you need to say here. Mr. Carter hesitated. Are you certain? Daniel gestured around the table. We're family. Emily almost laughed at the word. Family. After what had just happened here, Mr. Carter opened his briefcase. He removed a thin folder and placed it carefully on the table. Emily, your father left very specific instructions for today. Emily's voice trembled slightly. What kind of instructions? Mr. Carter slid a document toward her. The first concerns the ownership of his company. Daniel leaned forward immediately. Company? Mr. Carter looked up. Yes. Emily frowned. My father didn't own a company. Mr. Carter tilted his head. You weren't aware? Emily slowly shook her head. No. Mr. Carter folded his hands together. Your father was the founder and majority owner of a medical technology corporation currently valued at approximately $1 billion. Silence dropped across the room. Daniel's sister laughed first. A quick burst of disbelief. Okay, that's funny. No one else laughed. Because Mr. Carter wasn't smiling. Daniel stared at him. Wait, you're serious? Yes. Emily felt the ground shift under her feet. $1 billion? Mr. Carter nodded. The company specializes in metabolic medicine and obesity treatment technology. Emily's heart skipped. Obesity research. That was her field. The same field she had spent years discussing with her father during long phone calls and late-night study sessions. But her father had always described their work as small experiments, early ideas. Daniel leaned closer to the documents. Hold on, he said. You're telling me Emily's father secretly owned $1 billion company? Mr. Carter calmly opened another folder. Yes, Emily whispered. That's impossible. Mr. Carter slid another paper across the table. Actually, it isn't. Daniel looked at Emily. You never mentioned any of this. Emily's voice was barely audible. Because I didn't know. Mr. Carter reached into the briefcase again. There is also a personal letter your father asked me to deliver. He handed Emily a sealed envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she recognized the handwriting. Her father's. She opened it slowly, and as her eyes moved across the page, her knees nearly gave out, because the letter began with words that no one else in that room was prepared to hear. Emily, if you're reading this, it means the company is finally ready, and it also means I'm gone. But the world is about to learn something important. You weren't just my daughter. You were my partner, and everything we built together is now yours. Emily lowered the letter. The room felt completely different now. Daniel stared at her, then at the documents, then back at Mr. Carter, and slowly, the confidence on his face began to fade, because the woman he had just humiliated in front of his entire family was suddenly connected to something far bigger than anyone in that house had imagined, and the truth they were only beginning to understand. was that Emily's life had just changed forever. The dining room stayed silent long after Emily lowered the letter. No one reached for food. No one spoke. Even the air in the room felt different now, as if the house itself had paused to listen. Emily's fingers rested lightly against the paper. Her father's handwriting looked exactly the same as it always had. Rounded letters, careful spacing, the way he always wrote when something mattered. Her eyes moved back to the beginning of the letter. Emily, if you're reading this, it means the company is finally ready. And it also means I'm gone. Emily inhaled slowly. The word gone hit harder the second time she read it. Her father had never been dramatic. He was the kind of man who believed problems could be solved with patience, curiosity, and a good notebook. Growing up, Emily had watched him fill dozens of those notebooks. Observations, theories, questions written in the margins. Their conversations often lasted late into the night. Even after she moved out, even after she married Daniel, her father still called her regularly to discuss ideas, research, patterns he noticed in medical data, the things that didn't make sense about how obesity was treated. Emily continued reading, but the world is about to learn something important. You weren't just my daughter. You were my partner. Her throat tightened. Partner, the word, brought back memories she hadn't thought about in years. Sitting at the kitchen table in her father's house, stacks of research papers between them, coffee cups growing cold while they argued about metabolic resistance. Her father pointing at charts and saying, "Look at this pattern." Emily leaning closer and responding, "That pattern doesn't match traditional diet models." Then, hours of discussion would follow, ideas bouncing back and forth until one of them discovered something new. Back then, Emily believed those conversations were just curiosity, academic exploration. She never imagined they were building something much bigger. Across the table, Daniel leaned forward. "Can I see that?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were still fixed on the page. The next line made her chest tighten even more. "The treatment works because of the questions you asked, because of the patterns you noticed, because you refused to accept simple explanations for complicated bodies." Emily remembered the first time she argued with her father about weight loss science. She had been frustrated. Doctors had told her the same advice over and over: eat less, exercise more, but Emily's body didn't respond the way textbooks said it should. She worked harder than most people she knew. Still, her weight barely moved. One evening she told her father, "Something about this doesn't add up." Her father didn't dismiss her. Instead, he asked, "What do you think is missing?" That question had changed everything. It led them into years of research. Hormonal imbalance, metabolic resistance, the way certain bodies processed energy differently. The deeper Emily and her father studied the issue, the clearer one truth became: obesity was far more complex than most doctors admitted. Emily continued reading. Your struggles helped reveal what traditional research ignored. And because of that, millions of people may finally receive the help they deserve. Emily lowered the letter slowly. Her hands trembled slightly. Mr. Carter watched quietly from the end of the table. Daniel stared at the documents again, his eyes moving quickly across numbers printed on the page. Financial figures, ownership percentages, legal statements. His expression had changed. The confident amusement from earlier was gone. Now his face showed something else. Calculation. Daniel looked at Mr. Carter. "You're saying the company really is worth $1 billion? Mr. Carter nodded calmly. "That is the current valuation." Daniel exhaled slowly. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Emily as if seeing her from a new angle. "So, Emily is—" "What exactly?" Mr. Carter answered without hesitation. "Majority owner." The words landed heavily. Daniel blinked. "Majority?" "Yes." Daniel glanced around the table. His sister sat perfectly still. His father stared at the documents. No one was laughing anymore. Daniel looked back at Emily. "You helped invent the treatment?" Emily spoke quietly. "I didn't know it had reached this stage." Mr. Carter folded his hands together. "Your father protected you from the pressure." Emily looked at him. "Why?" Mr. Carter gave a small smile. He believed the world could be harsh toward people who challenged traditional thinking. Emily understood what he meant. A black woman, researching obesity, speaking openly about her own body. Yes, the world could be harsh about that. Daniel rubbed his chin slowly. Then his voice softened in a way it hadn't earlier. Emily, this is incredible. She looked at him. The shift in his tone was immediate, clear, sudden admiration replacing earlier ridicule. You should have told me about all this research, Daniel said. Emily's voice remained steady. I didn't know. Daniel nodded quickly. Right. He leaned forward again. Well, we can figure it out together. Emily studied him carefully. 10 minutes ago, he had shouted something humiliating across the table. Now his voice carried enthusiasm, support, encouragement. The change was impossible to ignore. And for the first time that day, Emily noticed something she hadn't fully seen before. Daniel's approval always arrived when something benefited him, not before. Her father's letter still rested in her hand. She folded it carefully, and in that quiet moment, something subtle shifted inside her. Not anger, not revenge, just awareness. The marriage she believed in for 10 years was beginning to reveal its true shape, and Daniel was only starting to realize the power of the woman sitting across from him. For several minutes after Mr. Carter confirmed the numbers, the dining room stayed unnaturally quiet. Plates of food sat untouched. Steam from the dishes had already faded. The lunch Emily spent hours preparing no longer mattered to anyone at the table, because one idea had replaced every other thought. $1 billion. Daniel leaned forward again, studying the documents like a man trying to make sure his eyes weren't lying to him. Metabolic medicine, he murmured, reading the description. Mr. Carter nodded calmly. Yes. Daniel tapped the page with his finger. And this treatment platform, it's already tested. Clinical trials are in advanced stages. Daniel's father shifted in his chair. You're saying this could actually work? Mr. Carter answered carefully. The results have been extremely promising. Daniel's sister let out a quiet breath. So, Emily helped invent something that helps people lose weight. Mr. Carter adjusted his glasses slightly. It addresses metabolic resistance, which is a major factor in obesity. Daniel leaned back again. His mind was clearly moving quickly now. The same man who had shouted across the table less than an hour ago was suddenly looking at Emily like she had stepped into a completely different category. You realize what this means, right? Daniel said. Emily looked at him calmly. What do you think it means? Daniel gestured toward the paperwork. This is huge. He looked around the room. $1 billion medical company. Daniel's sister picked up her phone. Let me see if anything about this is online. She typed quickly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she froze. Wait. Daniel looked at her. What? She turned the phone around so everyone could see. A news article had just appeared. The headline was simple. Houston Medical Company announces breakthrough treatment for metabolic disorders. Daniel's father leaned closer. Scroll. She did. The article described years of research into obesity and metabolic dysfunction. The company had remained mostly private while testing the treatment. But that morning, only hours earlier, the company released a statement confirming the success of their latest clinical results. Daniel read quietly. Then he reached for his own phone. Within seconds, more headlines appeared. Medical blogs, health research websites, discussion forums. The story was spreading quickly. Daniel's sister gasped softly. There's a photo. Emily looked up. Of what? Her phone screen turned toward the table. A picture from years earlier filled the display. Emily recognized it instantly. It had been taken during a conference presentation. She stood beside her father at a podium, holding printed research slides. She looked younger, confident. The caption beneath the photo read, Research contributors include Emily, whose personal metabolic case studies helped shape early development. Daniel's cousin leaned closer. Your name is in the article. Emily felt a strange mix of emotions rising inside her. Shock, grief, disbelief, because every headline meant one thing. Her father's work had truly reached the world. Daniel kept scrolling through his phone. More links appeared every minute. Discussion threads were already forming. Doctors debating the science, researchers asking questions, patients sharing personal stories. Daniel looked up again. This is blowing up. Emily stayed quiet. Daniel's sister refreshed the page again. Now social media posts were appearing, people discussing the treatment, people tagging friends. One comment caught her attention. Finally, someone is addressing metabolic resistance instead of blaming people. Another message read, "If this treatment works, it could change millions of lives." Emily looked down at the table. Her father had believed that for years. Daniel suddenly stood up from his chair. "Emily, this is massive." His voice carried excitement now, the same voice he used during important business deals. "You're about to become a very public figure." Emily frowned slightly. "I don't want attention." Daniel shook his head. "It's not about wanting it." He gestured toward the phones on the table. "You already have it." Mr. Carter nodded quietly. "The company will likely receive media requests soon." Daniel's eyes lit up slightly. "That's good." Emily looked at him. "Good." Daniel smiled. "This is a major opportunity." He began pacing slowly near the table, thinking aloud. "Press coverage means awareness." He pointed toward the article again. "Awareness means investors." He stopped walking and looked directly at Emily. "You're sitting on something that could dominate the entire medical industry." Emily's voice remained calm. "This research was never about domination." Daniel waved his hand dismissively. I know. But still, the impact will be huge." He leaned forward again. "Interviews are going to start happening." Emily's stomach tightened. "Interviews?" "Of course," Daniel said. "News networks will want to talk to you." He looked back at the article. "You're the human story behind the science." Emily noticed something in his tone. It wasn't pride. It was strategy. Daniel continued speaking quickly. "You'll need a communication plan." Emily stared at him. "A what?" Daniel pulled out his phone again. "Media appearances. Messaging. Branding." Emily blinked. "Branding?" Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely." He pointed toward the article again. "This story already has a narrative." He looked directly at her. "The woman whose personal struggle helped inspire a medical breakthrough." Emily felt uncomfortable. "That's not the point of the research." Daniel shrugged. "It doesn't matter what the point was." He tapped the screen. "What matters is how the story reaches people." Emily studied his face carefully. Just hours earlier, he had laughed at her body. Now he was talking about messaging strategies, public narratives, influence. The shift was so quick it almost felt dizzying. Emily asked quietly, "Why are you suddenly so invested in this?" Daniel looked surprised. "Because you're my wife." Emily held his gaze. "You didn't sound proud of that earlier." Daniel's expression tightened slightly. That was different. Emily didn't argue. She simply watched him. And the more he talked about media plans and public image, the clearer something became. Daniel wasn't reacting to the science. He was reacting to the power. And Emily realized something else at that moment. The man who had mocked her an hour earlier was already trying to position himself beside her success. The house had grown quieter. Daniel's family eventually drifted into the living room, their voices softer now, their conversations filled with speculation about the news spreading online. Phones kept lighting up. More headlines, more messages, more attention building around something none of them fully understood yet. But Emily couldn't stay inside that room any longer. She stepped through the back door and into the backyard. Houston's afternoon sun sat high in the sky, bright and unforgiving, but the air carried a faint breeze that moved gently across the pool. The water shimmered with reflections of light. Emily walked slowly across the patio and sat down on a wooden bench near the edge of the yard. For the first time since the lawyer arrived, she allowed herself to breathe without someone watching her. She still held her father's letter. Her fingers traced the edge of the folded paper. And suddenly the reality of what Mr. Carter had said earlier returned with full weight. "Your father passed away this morning." The words settled deeper now. Inside the house, everything had moved so fast. Documents, numbers, conversations, phones buzzing with news. But grief moves differently than the rest of the world. It arrives quietly, and once it settles, it stays. Emily looked toward the trees lining the back fence. Her father had always loved quiet spaces like this. Whenever she visited him growing up, he preferred sitting outside with a notebook rather than watching television. He once told her something she never forgot. Thinking requires space. Emily remembered asking him what that meant. He smiled and tapped the side of his head. "When the world gets loud, ideas hide." Her chest tightened slightly. He had spent his entire life chasing ideas, trying to understand things most people ignored, and now he was gone. Emily closed her eyes. A few tears slipped down her cheeks, not dramatic sobs, just quiet grief. She wiped them away gently. Then she heard the back door open. Footsteps approached across the patio. Daniel. He walked toward the bench slowly, stopping a few feet away before sitting beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. "This is a lot," he said quietly. Emily didn't answer. The breeze moved lightly through the trees. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about your father." Emily nodded once. "Thank you." The silence returned again. Daniel glanced toward the pool, watching the water ripple. Then he spoke again. "You must be overwhelmed." Emily stared ahead. "Yes." Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. "You know, none of this changes anything between us." Emily turned her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel shrugged. "You and me." He gave a small smile. "We're still a team." Emily studied his face carefully. 10 years of marriage teaches you how to read small signals. And right now, Daniel looked less confident than usual. His voice carried something new. "Uncertainty," Emily asked softly. "Are we?" Daniel frowned. "Of course we are." Emily looked down at the letter in her hands. "You didn't sound like my teammate earlier." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Emily, about that." She waited. Daniel leaned back against the bench. "I didn't mean what I said at the table." Emily's eyes returned to him. "You're too fat to be my wife." She repeated the sentence calmly. Daniel winced slightly. "Yeah." He rubbed his forehead. "I was frustrated." Emily said nothing. Daniel continued. "Things get tense when family is around." Still no response. Daniel shifted in his seat. "You know how people are." Emily finally spoke. "You meant it." Daniel shook his head quickly. "No." Emily's voice stayed steady. "Yes, you did." Daniel looked at her again. For a moment, he seemed unsure what to say. Emily continued quietly. "People say honest things when they stop pretending." Daniel stared at the ground. "That's not fair." Emily turned slightly toward him. "What part isn't fair?" Daniel hesitated. "I've always cared about your health." Emily nodded. "Yes." Then she asked something simple. "Did humiliating me help my health?" Daniel had no answer. The question lingered in the warm afternoon air. Emily looked back toward the yard. "You didn't defend me when they started joking." Daniel sighed. "I didn't think it was that serious." Emily's voice remained calm. "It was serious to me." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "You know I didn't want to embarrass you." Emily gave a small, tired smile. "You didn't want to embarrass yourself." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "That's not true." Emily looked directly at him now. "For 10 years I've tried to make this marriage comfortable for you." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" Emily spoke slowly. "It means I stopped talking about things that interested me." She tapped the folded letter lightly. "I stopped sharing my research because you never seemed interested." Daniel opened his mouth, but Emily continued. "I tried to become quieter." Daniel shook his head. "You're exaggerating." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Am the first?" Daniel didn't respond, because somewhere deep down he knew there was truth in what she was saying. Emily leaned back against the bench. "You laughed at me today." Daniel looked away. Emily continued softly. "And now, suddenly, you're proud of me." Daniel turned back toward her quickly. "I am proud of you." Emily held his gaze. "Or are you proud of what I just inherited?" Daniel's expression tightened. "That's not fair." Emily looked at him for several seconds. Then she said something that made Daniel's chest tighten. "You meant what you said earlier." Daniel swallowed. And for the first time since the lawyer arrived, he realized something unsettling. Emily wasn't trying to defend the marriage. She wasn't trying to smooth over the conflict. She wasn't even raising her voice. She was simply observing him, like a scientist, studying a pattern she had finally recognized. And that realization made Daniel uneasy in a way he couldn't quite explain, because the quiet woman he had grown used to was beginning to look at him very differently now, and he had no idea what that change might mean for their future. The next morning in Houston began earlier than usual. Emily woke up before the alarm. For a moment she didn't remember why her chest felt heavy. Then the memories returned all at once. Her father's letter, the company, the conversation with Daniel in the backyard, the realization that something inside their marriage had shifted. She sat up slowly on the couch in the living room. At some point during the night, she must have fallen asleep there while reading the letter again. The television was still on, muted. The early morning news played across the screen. Emily rubbed her eyes and looked up. Then she froze. Her face filled the television. A photo from the conference years earlier appeared on the broadcast. The same image that had circulated online the day before. Emily standing beside her father, holding research slides. A banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Houston scientist behind promising metabolic breakthrough, identified. Emily leaned forward slightly. The reporter was speaking with clear excitement. Medical researchers say the discovery could change how obesity and metabolic resistance are treated in the future. Emily reached for the remote and raised the volume. Sources confirm that Emily, whose personal metabolic case studies contributed to the research, is now the majority owner of the company following the passing of her father. Emily stared quietly at the screen. Hearing those words spoken out loud made everything feel more real. Her father was gone, but his work had finally reached the world. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Daniel walked into the living room, wearing a wrinkled shirt and loosened tie. He looked exhausted. Clearly, he had slept even less than she had. Daniel stopped when he saw the television. Then he looked at Emily. "You're on the news again." Emily nodded slowly. "I see that." Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "I got 6 calls before 7 this morning." Emily muted the TV again. "From who?" "My coworkers," Daniel said. "They're asking if the story is real." Emily didn't answer. Daniel walked closer to the screen. Another headline appeared. "Breakthrough obesity treatment linked to Houston research team." Daniel stared for a moment. Then he turned toward Emily. "This is everywhere." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Then again and again. Emily picked it up. The screen showed a growing list of notifications. Messages from old professors, emails from medical journalists, calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Daniel leaned closer. How many messages? Emily scrolled quietly. 42 missed calls. Daniel let out a short whistle. "Yeah, this is getting big." Outside, a car door slammed. Emily glanced toward the window. Then another door slammed. Daniel walked toward the front curtains and pulled them slightly open. His eyebrows lifted. "Well, that was fast." Emily stood and walked over beside him. Across the street, several news vans had parked along the curb. Camera crews stood near the sidewalk. Microphones, tripods, reporters speaking into phones while looking toward the house. Emily's stomach tightened. "They're here?" Daniel nodded slowly. "They're definitely here." One reporter pointed toward the house while speaking to someone through a headset. Daniel stepped back from the window. "You're officially a public story now." Emily looked down at her phone again. More notifications continued appearing. One message from an old professor read, "Emily, the research community is talking about your father's work everywhere." Another message from a former classmate said, "You and your father may have changed obesity medicine forever." Emily exhaled slowly. She had never wanted attention. The research mattered. Helping people mattered. But public exposure had never been part of her plans. Daniel was studying the reporters outside again. "This is an opportunity." Emily looked at him. "An opportunity?" Daniel nodded. "Media attention can shape how the world sees you." Emily folded her arms slightly. "I'm not interested in shaping anything." Daniel turned toward her. "But you should be." His tone carried the same energy he used when discussing business strategies. "You're not just a scientist anymore." Emily frowned. "What am I?" Daniel gestured toward the reporters. "You're a story." Emily didn't like the way that sounded. Daniel continued, "You'll get interview requests soon." Emily shook her head. "I don't want interviews." Daniel gave a small laugh. "That's not how this works." Emily studied his face. "What do you mean?" Daniel walked back toward the couch. "When something like this hits the news cycle, the media builds a narrative." He picked up Emily's phone and scrolled through the notifications. "Right now, the narrative is simple." Emily crossed her arms. "And what is it?" Daniel looked up at her. "The woman whose personal struggle helped inspire a medical breakthrough." Emily felt uncomfortable hearing it phrased that way. Daniel continued, "You need someone helping manage that story." Emily narrowed her eyes slightly. "Manage it?" "How?" Daniel leaned forward. "Interviews, public messaging, media strategy." Emily stared at him. You sound like a marketing consultant. Daniel shrugged. I understand how influence works. Emily's voice remained calm. And you want to manage mine? Daniel nodded. I can help guide things. Emily studied him carefully. Just yesterday he had laughed about her body across the dining table. Now he was talking about guiding her public image. The change was impossible to ignore. Emily asked quietly, "Why are you suddenly so interested in helping me?" Daniel looked surprised. "Because you're my wife." Emily held his gaze. "Yes." Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind. "Or because you see something valuable to attach yourself to." Daniel blinked. "That's not fair." Emily didn't argue. She simply watched him. And something about that calm observation made Daniel uneasy, because the woman standing in front of him was no longer seeking his approval. She was studying him, and Daniel had the uncomfortable feeling that he might not like what she was beginning to see. By late morning, the news vans outside the house had multiplied. 2 had become 5, then 6. Reporters stood near the sidewalk speaking into microphones, waiting for a chance to catch even a glimpse of Emily walking outside. Inside the house, the constant buzzing of phones had turned into a steady background sound. Calls, emails, messages. Emily sat at the kitchen table reading through several of them, while Mr. Carter spoke quietly on the phone near the window. Daniel paced slowly across the living room floor, checking the news on his tablet. Every few minutes, another article appeared. More headlines, more discussions. Mr. Carter ended his call and turned toward Emily. "The company board would like to meet with you today." Emily looked up. "Today?" "Yes," Mr. Carter said calmly. "They believe it would be helpful to discuss the next steps." Emily glanced toward the window, where reporters waited outside. "That might be difficult." Mr. Carter gave a small smile. "The headquarters has a private entrance." Daniel stopped pacing. "That makes sense," he said quickly. "They should definitely meet with her." Emily noticed the way he said her, as if he had stepped slightly outside the situation to observe it. Mr. Carter nodded. "They are expecting us within the hour." Emily folded her father's letter carefully and placed it back in her bag. Her heart beat faster as she stood up. She had spent years discussing research with her father, but she had never visited the place where all of it had grown into something real. Daniel picked up his jacket. "I'll come with you." Emily looked at him. Mr. Carter spoke before she could answer. The board requested a private meeting with Emily. Daniel paused. "Oh," Mr. Carter continued gently. "You're welcome to join later if necessary." Daniel nodded slowly, though his expression tightened slightly. Emily noticed, but she didn't comment. Instead, she followed Mr. Carter out through the side entrance of the house where a car waited. The drive across Houston took nearly 40 minutes. Traffic moved slowly through the midday heat. Emily sat quietly in the back seat, while Mr. Carter reviewed several documents. Her mind kept drifting back to the letter in her bag. Partner. Her father had called her his partner. For years she believed their research discussions were simply curiosity, but now she understood. He had taken every idea she shared seriously, every question, every theory, and somewhere during those long conversations, something groundbreaking had formed. Eventually, the car turned onto a wide boulevard surrounded by glass buildings. Mr. Carter gestured toward a tall structure ahead. "That's the headquarters." Emily leaned slightly toward the window. The building rose several stories into the sky, its exterior covered in reflective glass. Clean lines, modern architecture, the kind of place where people worked on ideas meant to shape the future. The car pulled into an underground entrance and stopped near a secured elevator. When Emily stepped out, her stomach tightened slightly. This place had been her father's world. The elevator doors opened into a spacious lobby filled with natural light. Polished floors reflected the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Several people stood near the reception desk. The moment Emily stepped into the room, something unexpected happened. They stood, all of them. A group of scientists and researchers gathered near the desk turned toward her. One person started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire lobby filled with applause. Emily froze. She hadn't expected anything like this. Mr. Carter leaned slightly toward her. "They know who you are." Emily looked around the room. Faces filled with respect, curiosity, gratitude. One woman stepped forward from the group. She wore a lab coat with a badge clipped near her collar. "You're Emily." Emily nodded quietly. The woman smiled warmly. "We've been hoping to meet you." Emily blinked. "Me, yes." The woman gestured toward a large glass hallway leading deeper into the building. "Your metabolic resistance model changed the direction of our research." Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. "My model?" The woman laughed softly. "Your father showed us your work years ago." Emily felt stunned. "I thought those were just ideas." The woman shook her head. "They were the foundation." Another researcher stepped closer. "We built several clinical trials based on those patterns." Emily glanced toward Mr. Carter, who simply nodded. Her father had been listening to her far more closely than she ever realized. The woman continued speaking. "You helped us understand why traditional weight loss approaches fail for certain patients." Emily's voice came out quietly. "I was just trying to figure out why the data didn't make sense." The researcher smiled. "That curiosity is exactly what led to the breakthrough." Emily looked around the room again. For the first time that day, she didn't feel like the subject of gossip or attention. She felt like something else, a colleague, someone whose work mattered. The applause slowly faded as the researchers returned to their conversations. Mr. Carter guided Emily toward a hallway lined with glass-walled laboratories. Inside one room, technicians studied screens filled with medical data. Another room contained equipment used for metabolic testing. Emily stopped walking for a moment. "This is all because of the research?" Mr. Carter nodded. "Your father believed the world underestimated the complexity of obesity." Emily looked through the glass at the scientists working carefully with their instruments. For years, she had defended that same belief during academic discussions. Often people dismissed it, told her she was overthinking something simple. Now she was standing inside a building filled with people who had taken the idea seriously. Mr. Carter gestured toward a large conference room ahead. "The board is waiting inside." Emily nodded slowly, but before she walked through the door, she paused. Something inside her had shifted. For years, she had quietly carried the feeling that her voice didn't matter as much as other people's, that her research was secondary, that her opinions were inconvenient. But standing here, surrounded by people who respected the work she had done, Emily realized something important. She had never needed Daniel's approval. Not once. The confidence she thought she lost had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right room, and this room was finally hers. The house felt unusually quiet after Emily left. Daniel stood near the front window for several minutes after the car disappeared down the street. The reporters were still outside. A few had moved closer to the sidewalk, cameras resting on their shoulders as they spoke into microphones. Every now and then, one of them glanced toward the house, clearly hoping the front door might open again. Daniel let the curtain fall back into place. He walked slowly into the living room and sat down on the couch. For the first time since yesterday afternoon, there was no one in the room to distract him. No family members, no lawyer, no Emily, just the low hum of the television still playing in the background. He picked up the remote and raised the volume slightly. Another news segment had started. A woman on the screen was speaking with clear excitement. "Medical researchers are calling the discovery one of the most promising advancements in metabolic treatment in decades." Daniel leaned back. Emily's photo appeared again. The same conference image from years ago. She stood beside her father, holding a set of printed charts while speaking at the podium. Daniel studied the image carefully. It looked so different from the Emily he had been picturing in his mind for years. In the photograph, she looked confident, focused. Her eyes carried the quiet intensity of someone explaining an idea they believed in deeply. The television host continued speaking. Emily's personal metabolic research contributions helped shape the early foundation of the treatment. Daniel muted the television again. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind returned to the moment at the dining table. The sound of his own voice echoed clearly in his memory. "You're too fat to be my wife." At the time, the words had felt justified, like something he had been holding back for too long. Now the sentence sounded different. Not powerful, not honest, just cruel. Daniel rubbed his face slowly. He stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Emily's cooking still sat on the table. The chicken, the greens, the cornbread. No one had finished the meal. He pulled out a chair and sat down again. Across the table, the empty seat where Emily had been sitting yesterday seemed strangely significant now. Daniel picked up his phone and opened one of the articles he had been reading earlier. Another headline had appeared. Medical community praises Houston research breakthrough. He tapped the link. The article described the years of work behind the treatment. Clinical testing. Scientific validation. One paragraph caught his attention. Sources close to the research team say Emily's metabolic pattern analysis was essential to identifying the hormonal resistance that traditional weight loss studies had overlooked. Daniel frowned slightly. He had never heard Emily describe her work that way. To him, it had always sounded like small academic projects, data analysis, conference presentations. He remembered how often she tried to talk about it during dinner, explaining something about metabolic signals or hormone patterns. Most of the time, he had nodded politely while checking his phone. Sometimes he changed the subject. Sometimes he made a joke. Daniel leaned back slowly. For the first time, he wondered how many of those conversations had been more important than he realized. He opened another article, then another. Each one repeated the same theme: Emily's contribution to the research, Emily's personal experience with metabolic resistance, Emily's partnership with her father. Daniel lowered the phone. The room suddenly felt smaller, because a thought had begun forming in his mind that he couldn't ignore anymore. Yesterday afternoon, he had shouted something humiliating across a table full of people, and now, the same woman he mocked was being praised by medical researchers across the country. Daniel stood up and began pacing slowly through the room. His thoughts moved faster now. He imagined how the story would sound if reporters started digging deeper. The headlines were already spreading. Eventually, someone might mention her husband. Someone might ask questions about their marriage. Daniel stopped walking. His stomach tightened, because suddenly another realization appeared. If Emily ever told the story of what happened at that table, the entire world might hear it. He looked toward the front door again. Reporters still waited outside. Daniel returned to the couch and sat down heavily. The phone in his hand buzzed with another notification. He opened it slowly. A social media post appeared. Someone had shared Emily's story alongside a comment. It's inspiring to see a woman turn personal struggle into scientific progress. Daniel stared at the sentence. Inspiring. That was the word people were using. Emily. Inspiring. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The balance between them had changed, not because of money, not even because of the company. It had changed because the world now saw Emily differently. And if the world saw her differently, eventually she might begin seeing herself differently too. Daniel opened his eyes again. A thought slipped into his mind that he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. What if Emily realized she didn't need him anymore? The question sat there quietly, uncomfortable. Daniel looked around the empty house, the expensive furniture, the quiet rooms, the kitchen where she had stood that morning making oatmeal. For years he had assumed this life belonged to both of them equally, but suddenly he wasn't sure, because the woman he married yesterday was not the same woman walking into that company headquarters today. And if Emily came home tonight with a new understanding of her own power, Daniel had a feeling the future of their marriage might look very different. A colder thought followed right behind it. What if she decided to leave? The idea settled heavily in his chest, and for the first time since the lawyer knocked on the door, Daniel felt something he rarely experienced: fear. By the time Emily returned home that evening, the neighborhood looked completely different. More news vans had arrived. Cameras lined the sidewalk. Reporters stood in small groups discussing the latest headlines while checking their phones for updates. Some neighbors had stepped outside their houses, curious about the sudden attention surrounding the quiet street. Emily's car pulled slowly into the driveway. The moment it stopped, several reporters noticed. A few cameras immediately turned in her direction. Mr. Carter stepped out of the car first and spoke quietly to the driver. "Take the side entrance." Emily nodded and walked quickly toward the house, while reporters called out questions from the sidewalk. "Emily, do you believe your father's research will change obesity treatment? Are you planning to speak publicly tonight? Emily, what message do you have for people struggling with weight?" Emily didn't stop, not because the questions didn't matter, but because the day had already been overwhelming enough. She stepped inside the house and closed the door behind her. The quiet inside felt almost strange after the noise outside. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table. A laptop sat open in front of him. Several news websites filled the screen. He looked up the moment Emily entered. "You're back." Emily placed her bag on the counter. "Yes." Daniel studied her face carefully. "You were gone most of the day." "The meeting lasted longer than expected," she replied. Daniel stood up and closed the laptop slowly. "So, how did it go?" Emily poured herself a glass of water before answering. "It was productive." Daniel leaned against the counter. "Productive? How?" Emily took a sip. "The board explained the clinical trials." Daniel nodded quickly. "And the results are strong." Daniel smiled. "I figured they would be." He walked around the table and stood a little closer. "You know the story is getting bigger by the hour, right?" Emily glanced toward the front window, where faint flashes from cameras occasionally reflected across the glass. "Yes." Daniel folded his arms. "I've been watching the coverage all afternoon." Emily waited. Daniel's tone shifted slightly. "They're calling the treatment one of the most promising developments in metabolic medicine." Emily sat down at the table. "That's encouraging." Daniel nodded. "It's more than encouraging." He leaned forward slightly. "It's powerful." Emily looked up. Daniel continued speaking with the same energy he used during corporate negotiations. "Media. Attention like this doesn't happen often." Emily stayed quiet. Daniel tapped the laptop screen. "Your name is everywhere." Emily noticed the difference in the way he spoke now. Yesterday, her body had been the focus of his criticism. Today, her name had become the center of his interest. Daniel continued. "You're going to get interview requests." "I already have," Emily said. Daniel nodded eagerly. "That's good." Emily frowned slightly. "Why is that good?" Daniel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Because public attention can shape how people see the research." Emily tilted her head. "The science speaks for itself." Daniel gave a small laugh. "That's not how public perception works." Emily studied him. Daniel leaned forward. "You need someone who understands strategy." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What kind of strategy?" "Media positioning," Daniel said quickly. "Messaging. Public appearances." Emily took another sip of water. "And you think you should handle that?" Daniel smiled slightly. "I have experience dealing with corporate communications." Emily didn't respond immediately. Daniel continued. "You're stepping into a huge leadership role." "Yes," Emily said calmly. "And leadership requires planning." Emily folded her hands on the table. "Are you offering advice or asking for a job?" Daniel blinked. "What?" Emily's voice remained steady. "You're talking like a consultant." Daniel leaned back. "I'm talking like your husband." Emily held his gaze. "Those aren't always the same thing." Daniel's smile faded slightly. "Emily, I'm trying to help." She nodded slowly. "But earlier, you were laughing about my body in front of your family." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "That was different." Emily didn't raise her voice. "How?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I told you I was frustrated." Emily studied him carefully. "And now?" Daniel hesitated. "Now things have changed." Emily leaned back in her chair. "Yes." Daniel leaned forward again. "And that's exactly why you need someone on your side." Emily looked at him quietly. "Are you on my side, Daniel?" The question hung between them. Daniel answered quickly. "Of course I am." Emily's voice stayed calm. "Or are you trying to stay close to something powerful?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." Emily said nothing. She simply watched him, and the longer the silence lasted, the clearer something became. Daniel wasn't offering support. He was trying to reclaim influence. But Emily wasn't the same person he had spoken to at the dining table the day before, and for the first time in their marriage, Daniel could feel control slipping out of his hands. The kitchen stayed quiet after Emily asked the question. "Are you on my side, Daniel?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands together slowly, as if buying time to think of the right response. Outside the house, the distant murmur of reporters could still be heard through the windows. Emily watched him carefully. 10 years of marriage had taught her something important. When Daniel spoke quickly, he was confident. When he paused like this, he was calculating. Finally, he exhaled. "Emily, we've been married a long time." She nodded slightly. "Yes." Daniel leaned forward again. "We've built a life together." Emily's voice stayed calm. "We lived in the same house." Daniel frowned. That's not the same thing. Emily rested her hands on the table. Isn't it? Daniel shook his head. You're twisting things. Emily didn't react to the frustration in his voice. Instead, she asked something simple. Do you remember the first time we talked about my research after we got married? Daniel blinked. What? Emily kept her eyes on him. It was about a year into our marriage. Daniel leaned back again. I don't remember every conversation. Emily nodded. That's the point. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're making this sound worse than it was. Emily spoke quietly. No, I'm finally describing it honestly. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Daniel shifted in his seat. You're acting like I ignored you for 10 years. Emily tilted her head slightly. You didn't ignore me. Daniel crossed his arms. Good. Emily continued. You dismissed me. Daniel's expression hardened. That's not true. Emily raised her hand slightly, stopping him before he could continue. You changed the subject when I talked about research. Daniel looked away. You checked your phone while I explained things that mattered to me. Daniel opened his mouth. Emily continued before he could respond. You laughed when I tried to explain metabolic resistance to your friends. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Emily leaned back in her chair. And yesterday, you laughed at my body in front of your entire family. Daniel slammed his hand lightly against the table. Enough. The word echoed through the room. But Emily didn't flinch. She simply looked at him. Daniel stood up and began pacing slowly across the kitchen. You're acting like I'm some kind of villain. Emily shook her head. I'm describing patterns. Daniel stopped walking. You're exaggerating those patterns. Emily gave a small, tired smile. Daniel, I spent 10 years minimizing them. The room grew quiet again. Daniel ran his hand through his hair. I never tried to hurt you. Emily studied his face carefully. I believe that. Daniel looked relieved. But intent doesn't erase impact, Emily added. Daniel's relief faded. He leaned against the counter. So what are you saying? Emily answered calmly. I'm saying I've spent a long time trying to become someone easier for you to accept. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Emily looked down at the table for a moment. Then she spoke slowly. I stopped sharing ideas that excited me. Daniel said nothing. I laughed at jokes that embarrassed me. Daniel's eyes dropped toward the floor. I apologized for things that weren't my fault. Daniel exhaled heavily. You're making our whole marriage sound miserable. Emily shook her head. It wasn't miserable all the time. Daniel looked up again. There were good moments. Yes, Emily agreed. Daniel stepped closer. So why are we talking like this? Emily met his gaze. Because yesterday, something changed. Daniel's expression tightened. You mean the company? Emily shook her head again. No. Daniel frowned. Then what? Emily answered quietly. I stopped pretending. Daniel stared at her. The words sat in the air between them. I used to believe the problem was me, Emily continued. Daniel's chest rose slowly as he breathed. I thought if I became smaller, quieter, easier, things would feel different. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Emily. She raised her hand again. Let me finish. Daniel fell silent. Emily's voice remained calm. But yesterday, I realized something important. Daniel waited. Emily looked directly into his eyes. You didn't love the real version of me. Daniel shook his head immediately. That's not true. Emily spoke gently. You loved the version of me that made you feel comfortable. Daniel's voice rose. I loved you. Emily held his gaze. Yes. Daniel took a step closer. And I still do. Emily's eyes softened slightly, but her voice stayed steady. You loved me when you felt bigger than me. Daniel froze. The sentence hit harder than any accusation. Emily continued quietly. When my research seemed small, you were relaxed. Daniel didn't move. When my body made me insecure, you were confident. Daniel's breathing slowed. But now that the world sees something valuable in me, she paused. You're afraid. Daniel stared at her. For the first time since the conversation began, he didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Because somewhere deep down, a part of him knew there was truth in what she was saying. Emily stood up slowly. The chair moved softly against the floor. She looked at him for several seconds. And Daniel suddenly understood something terrifying. Emily wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't trying to convince him of anything. She was simply seeing him clearly for the first time. And once someone sees the truth about a relationship, it becomes very hard to pretend again. The house felt different that night. Not quieter, not louder, just different. The conversation in the kitchen had ended without shouting, but the silence that followed carried more weight than any argument. Emily moved through the living room slowly, gathering a few papers from her bag and placing them neatly on the coffee table. Daniel remained in the kitchen for several minutes after she walked away. Eventually, he stepped into the living room as well, though his movements were slower than usual. Neither of them spoke. The television screen flickered softly in the background, playing a late evening news broadcast. Emily picked up the remote and turned the volume slightly higher. The research team behind the metabolic breakthrough is expected to address the media soon. A picture of Emily appeared on the screen again. The same conference photo, the same confident expression she wore while standing beside her father years ago. The news anchor continued speaking. Experts believe the treatment could offer hope to millions of patients who struggle with metabolic resistance. Emily watched quietly. Daniel watched her. Neither of them commented. After a moment, Emily muted the television again. "I have a press conference tomorrow." Daniel looked up. "Already?" Emily nodded. "The board thinks it's important to explain the science before speculation spreads." Daniel folded his arms. "That makes sense." Emily gathered the papers from the table again. "They want to clarify how the treatment works." Daniel nodded slowly. "Good." Emily placed the documents back in her bag. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You seem calm about all this." Emily looked at him. "Should I be panicking?" Daniel shrugged. "Most people would be." Emily sat down on the couch. "I spent years talking about this research with my father." Daniel leaned against the doorway. "Talking about it privately is different from facing cameras." Emily considered that. "That's true." Daniel walked closer. "So are you ready?" Emily nodded. "Yes." Daniel watched her carefully. "You've changed." Emily raised an eyebrow. "How?" Daniel hesitated. "You're different than yesterday." Emily leaned back against the couch. "Yesterday was a long day." Daniel shook his head slightly. "That's not what I mean." Emily waited. Daniel struggled to find the right words. "You're more certain now." Emily smiled faintly. "About what?" Daniel met her eyes. "About yourself." Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her father's letter again. The paper was already beginning to soften along the folds from being opened so many times. She held it carefully in her hands. "My father spent years believing in something most people dismissed," she said quietly. Daniel watched her. "He believed the science could help people." Emily's fingers traced the edge of the paper. "And he believed my ideas mattered." Daniel shifted slightly. "I never said they didn't." Emily looked up at him. "You didn't need to say it." Daniel's expression tightened again. He turned away and walked toward the kitchen counter, picking up his phone. Another news alert appeared on the screen. He opened it quickly. The headline read, "Medical Community Applauds Houston Research Team." Daniel read the article silently. Several quotes from doctors praised the research. Others described the treatment as groundbreaking. One sentence near the end of the article caught his attention. Emily's personal metabolic case study helped scientists identify patterns that traditional research had overlooked. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. The words echoed in his mind. Emily's case study, Emily's research, Emily's discovery. Daniel glanced toward the living room again. She sat quietly on the couch, reading the letter once more. For years, he had seen her as someone who needed guidance, someone who required encouragement, someone who depended on him. Now the entire world seemed to see something else. Daniel placed the phone down on the counter. The realization returned with uncomfortable clarity. The balance between them had changed, not in a dramatic moment, not through a single argument, but slowly, quietly, like a scale tipping after years of pressure. Emily folded the letter and placed it back inside her bag. Then she stood up. "I'm going to review the research notes before tomorrow." Daniel nodded. "That's probably a good idea." Emily walked toward the hallway, leading to the study. But before she disappeared into the room, Daniel spoke again. "Emily." She stopped and turned around. "Yes?" Daniel hesitated. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something important. Then he simply asked, "Do you still want this marriage?" The question hung in the air. Emily studied his face. The uncertainty in his eyes was new. Daniel had always carried himself with quiet confidence. Now that certainty seemed to be fading. Emily answered slowly, "I want honesty." Daniel frowned slightly. "That's not what I asked." Emily nodded. "I know." Daniel waited. Emily continued speaking calmly. "For a long time, I believed our marriage worked because I tried harder." Daniel looked down briefly. "But now I'm realizing something else," she said. Daniel looked back up. "What?" Emily's voice stayed steady. "A relationship shouldn't require someone to disappear inside it." Daniel didn't respond. Emily held his gaze for another moment. Then she turned and walked down the hallway. The door to the study closed quietly behind her. Daniel remained standing in the living room. The television screen continued showing news coverage about the research. Emily's photo appeared again. Her name scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Daniel sat down slowly on the couch, because deep down, he understood something that was becoming impossible to ignore. The woman inside that study was no longer trying to earn his approval. And the moment that realization fully settled in, Daniel knew the power inside their marriage had shifted in a way he might never recover from. Morning arrived quietly in Houston. The sunlight slipping through the kitchen windows felt softer than usual. Though the heat outside was already building, Emily stood at the counter pouring herself a glass of water. The house was silent. Daniel hadn't spoken much after their conversation the night before. He had eventually gone upstairs while Emily stayed in the study, reviewing research documents for the press conference scheduled later that afternoon. Neither of them had slept well. The tension between them had settled into something heavy, not explosive, just unavoidable. Emily took a slow sip of water and set the glass down. Her father's letter rested neatly beside her bag on the counter. She had read it again before coming into the kitchen. Each time she read it, a different line seemed to stand out. This morning, it was the same sentence that kept returning to her thoughts. "You were never just my daughter. You were my partner." For years, she believed she had been the weaker voice in most of the important conversations in her life. Now she understood that her father had seen something in her long before anyone else did, even before she saw it herself. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Daniel entered the kitchen. His shirt was wrinkled, his expression tired. He paused when he saw Emily standing at the counter. "Morning." Emily nodded. "Morning." Daniel walked toward the coffee machine and poured himself a cup. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I watched the news again this morning." Emily leaned lightly against the counter. "And they're still talking about the research." Emily nodded. "That will probably continue for a while." Daniel stared into his coffee. "You're speaking today." "Yes." Daniel took a slow sip. "Big audience?" "Mostly medical journalists," Emily replied. Daniel nodded again. "That's good." Another quiet moment passed. Then Daniel set his cup down and looked directly at her. "Emily, about last night." Emily waited. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been thinking about what you said." She didn't interrupt. Daniel continued. "You're right about some things." Emily remained calm. "Which things?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I haven't always been supportive." Emily didn't respond. Daniel walked closer to the counter. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about you." Emily studied his face carefully. 10 years had taught her how to recognize the difference between sincerity and discomfort. Daniel continued speaking. "We've built a life together." Emily answered quietly, "Yes." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "And we can fix what's broken." Emily's eyes stayed steady. "Can we?" Daniel nodded quickly. "Of course we can." Emily crossed her arms lightly. "How?" Daniel hesitated. "We can start fresh." Emily tilted her head slightly. "What does that mean?" Daniel gestured around the kitchen. "It means we stop focusing on the past." Emily looked down at the counter for a moment. Then she reached into her bag. Daniel watched curiously. She removed a thin envelope and placed it carefully on the counter between them. Daniel frowned. "What's that?" Emily met his eyes. "Something important." Daniel picked up the envelope slowly. When he opened it and looked at the papers inside, his face changed immediately. His eyes widened. "You're serious?" Emily's voice stayed calm. "Yes." Daniel stared at the document again. "Divorce papers." The words seemed to echo through the room. Daniel looked up at her. "You're ending our marriage." Emily nodded. "Yes." Daniel shook his head. This is happening too fast. Emily answered quietly. No. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Emily spoke slowly. This started years ago. Daniel pushed the papers back onto the counter. You're throwing away 10 years because of one argument. Emily met his gaze. It wasn't one argument. Daniel's voice rose slightly. Then what is it? Emily held his eyes. It's 10 years of small moments that told me I mattered less than you. Daniel stared at her. That's not fair. Emily's voice remained steady. Fairness isn't the issue. Daniel ran his hands through his hair. You're making a mistake. Emily shook her head gently. No. Daniel's voice softened. Emily, I love you. Emily believed he thought he meant it, but something inside her had already settled. Love should never feel like something you have to earn by shrinking yourself. She placed her hand lightly on the envelope again. I'm not angry, Daniel. Daniel looked confused. Then why are you doing this? Emily answered quietly. Because I finally respect myself. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. The conversation wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a decision. Emily picked up her bag. I have to prepare for the press conference. Daniel remained standing in the kitchen, still holding the divorce papers. Emily paused at the doorway. Then she said something softly. For the first time in a long time, I feel honest. Daniel didn't respond, because deep down he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. Emily wasn't asking for permission to leave. She had already done it. The conference hall at the company headquarters was already full when Emily arrived. Rows of chairs stretched across the room, each one occupied by reporters, medical journalists, and researchers who had traveled from different cities after hearing about the breakthrough. Cameras stood on tall tripods along the back wall. Microphones rested on a long table positioned at the front of the room. Large screens displayed the company logo beside a simple title, Metabolic Treatment Research Briefing. Emily paused briefly near the side entrance before stepping inside. The sound of quiet conversation filled the hall. Reporters flipped through notebooks. Others reviewed notes on their tablets. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the same moment. Emily's arrival. Mr. Carter stood near the podium speaking with several company representatives. When he noticed Emily entering, he gave her a small nod of encouragement. You ready? He asked quietly. Emily took a slow breath. Yes. For a moment she thought about her father. How many times they had sat across a table discussing research. How many times he had told her that truth mattered more than attention. Tell the truth, he used to say. People recognize honesty faster than perfection. Emily walked toward the podium. The room slowly grew quiet as people noticed her. One camera turned first, then another. Soon, every lens in the room pointed in her direction. Emily placed her notes on the podium. She glanced across the audience. So many faces, so many questions waiting to be asked. But the strange thing was that she didn't feel nervous, not the way she expected. Instead, she felt something else. Clarity. She adjusted the microphone slightly. Good afternoon. Her voice carried easily through the room. My name is Emily. A few reporters leaned forward, pens ready. Emily continued. Many of you are here today because you've read about a new treatment related to metabolic resistance and obesity. She paused briefly. But before we talk about the science, I want to talk about something else. The room became completely silent. Emily looked across the audience. For most of my life, I've struggled with my weight. Some reporters exchanged quick glances. Emily continued calmly. That experience shaped how I approached research. She rested her hands lightly on the podium. For years, the conversation around obesity has been very simple. She paused. Eat less. Exercise more. Several reporters nodded slightly. Emily continued. But human biology isn't always simple. She explained the research carefully. Metabolic resistance, hormonal imbalance, the way certain bodies respond differently to calorie restriction. She spoke clearly, avoiding complicated jargon, because she wanted the message to reach not only scientists, but also the people watching from home. The treatment our team developed focuses on correcting metabolic signals that traditional approaches often ignore, she said. A reporter raised a hand slightly, but waited. Emily continued speaking. My father spent years studying these patterns. Her voice softened slightly, and he believed people struggling with obesity deserved solutions based on science, not shame. Several reporters began writing quickly. Emily glanced briefly at her notes before continuing. For me, this research was always personal. She paused again, because I understood the frustration of doing everything right and still feeling like your body is working against you. A few quiet murmurs passed through the audience. Emily lifted her head and spoke the next words slowly. Sometimes the things people criticize about you, she paused, become the very things that push you to search for answers. The room stayed silent. Emily continued, and sometimes those answers help more people than you ever expected. She looked across the audience once more. Then she said the sentence that had been forming in her mind since yesterday. Sometimes the thing people mock about you becomes the reason you change the world. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone began clapping. Another person joined. Within seconds, the entire room filled with applause. Emily stood quietly while the sound echoed through the hall, not because she needed praise, but because she knew the message had reached people. Eventually, the applause faded. A reporter near the front raised his hand. Emily, what message do you have for people who struggle with weight and feel judged by society? Emily thought for a moment before answering. My message is simple. She looked directly toward the cameras. Your body is not a moral failure. The room grew quiet again. Emily continued, science should help people understand themselves better, not shame them. Several reporters nodded as they wrote. Another journalist raised a hand. Will the treatment be available soon? Emily answered carefully. There are still clinical steps ahead, but the early results are extremely encouraging. The questions continued for several minutes. About research, about the future of metabolic medicine, about her father's work. Emily answered each one calmly, but deep inside, she knew something important had already happened. The world now understood the science, and more importantly, they understood the human story behind it. When the conference finally ended, the room filled with quiet conversation again. Reporters packed their equipment. Others approached the podium, hoping to ask additional questions. Mr. Carter stepped beside Emily. That went very well. Emily smiled softly. I hope it helps people. Mr. Carter nodded. I think it will. Emily glanced back at the now empty podium. The moment felt larger than the press conference itself, because for the first time in years, she had spoken without shrinking herself, and the world had listened. The evening air in Houston had finally begun to cool. After the press conference, Emily asked the driver to take a different route home. Not the busy streets near the news vans, not the road that led directly back to the house where Daniel was still sitting with the divorce papers. Instead, she asked to be dropped off near a quiet park not far from the center of the city. The driver pulled up beside a small trail that curved around a wide pond. Emily stepped out of the car and thanked him before walking slowly toward the water. The sun was beginning to set. Golden light reflected across the surface of the pond. Tall trees lined the walking path, their leaves moving gently in the warm breeze. For the first time in 2 days, there were no reporters nearby, no cameras, no questions waiting to be answered, just quiet. Emily walked along the path at an unhurried pace. The events of the past 24 hours moved through her mind in fragments. The kitchen, Daniel's voice across the table, the knock at the door, Mr. Carter standing in the hallway with the briefcase, her father's letter, the company, the press conference. Everything had happened so quickly that her emotions had barely caught up with the reality of it all. She stopped near the edge of the pond and looked across the water. A few ducks floated quietly near the opposite bank. The sky above them glowed with shades of orange and soft pink. Emily took a slow breath. Her father used to enjoy places like this, simple spaces where conversation could happen without interruption. She remembered sitting with him at a small park table years ago while they argued about metabolic research. Emily had been frustrated that day. A doctor had dismissed her questions about hormonal resistance during a consultation. She told her father about it. I think they're missing something important, she said. Her father listened patiently. Then he asked a question she never forgot. What if the problem isn't the patient? Emily smiled faintly at the memory. That question had started everything. The long nights of research, the phone calls filled with theories, the slow discovery that something deeper was happening inside the human body than most people realized. And now that discovery was about to change lives. Emily sat down on a wooden bench facing the pond. The quiet allowed her thoughts to settle more clearly. For years she believed strength meant enduring things silently, enduring criticism, enduring small humiliations, enduring the slow erosion of confidence that happens when someone close to you treats your worth like a question instead of a fact. But today had shown her something different. Strength was not endurance. Strength was clarity. Clarity about what you deserve. Clarity about what you refuse to accept. Emily looked down at her hands, the same hands that once nervously flipped through research papers while discussing ideas with her father. The same hands that signed documents earlier that morning, ending a marriage she had spent 10 years trying to hold together. It was strange how life worked sometimes. The moment the world began seeing her as powerful, she realized the power had never come from money. It didn't come from headlines. It didn't come from cameras or applause. It came from something much quieter, self-respect. Emily leaned back against the bench. A gentle breeze moved through the trees again. For the first time in years, her thoughts felt peaceful, not because the future would be easy. The days ahead would bring attention, responsibility, decisions about the company and the treatment. But those challenges didn't frighten her, because she finally understood something important. The person she had been searching for all these years, the confident voice she thought she had lost somewhere along the way, had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for her to listen. Emily stood up from the bench and began walking again along the path. The lights around the park slowly flickered on as evening settled across the city. Somewhere in Houston, people were still talking about the research, still discussing the breakthrough, still sharing the story of a woman whose personal struggles helped lead to a medical discovery. But Emily wasn't thinking about the headlines anymore. She was thinking about her father, about the quiet faith he had placed in her ideas long before the world recognized them. She looked up at the evening sky and spoke softly. "Thank you, Dad." The words carried gently into the warm air. Then Emily continued walking down the path, not as someone defined by the past, not as someone trying to prove her worth to anyone else, but as the woman she had finally become, someone who understood that the most powerful transformation in life is not changing how the world sees you. It's finally seeing yourself clearly, and once that happens, freedom follows. Before you go, take a moment and think about Emily's story. Sometimes, the people closest to us slowly convince us that we need to become smaller, quieter, easier to accept, and after a while, we start believing that lie. But the truth is simple. The right people in your life will never require you to shrink in order to stay. If this story meant something to you, take a second to like the video. It helps more people discover stories that remind them of their own strength. And I'd really love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment in life where you finally chose self-respect over staying in a situation that was slowly breaking you? Tell me in the comments, and also share the time and the country you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how stories like this connect people from all over the world. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that they are already enough just as they are, share this story with them. Sometimes one story can change the way someone sees themselves forever.